Who was the weakest link in the band Queen? Well, let's talk about it. This was a really tough one. I had to go back and give a good listen to the first Queen album, and also gave a thorough listen to The Works, which was one of the last studio albums. And instead of going deep into the discography or way down into the history of the band, I thought I'd just take it on a member by member basis in this case. Now, the thing with Queen is there isn't a dominant player, although Freddie Mercury emerged as the dominant songwriter and he was the front man and he's arguably the most well-known member of the band. In reality, if you look into the evolution of Queen, all of the band members make almost an equal contribution. Now you can say, well, John Deacon didn't write as many songs and he's not as well known as the other guys, but he was extremely important in terms of Queen's business dealings, and he in fact was a significant contributor of song. This is one of the reasons why it's so hard to do a video like this on Queen. 4 equally contributing songwriters, and their albums are structured so that no one member of the band really overpowers any of the others. So let's get right down to work and go member by member. Starting off with Freddie Mercury, the lead vocalist, the front man, and the icon for the band. You could say you can't have Queen without Freddie Mercury, and I would agree with you. So more or less, Freddie Mercury is eliminated before the game even begins, but let's just entertain the notion for a moment that he could be the weakest link. All you have to do to prove that assertion wrong is point to the fact that once he sadly passed away, bands ceased to exist. They made an attempt to go out with Paul Rodgers, and it just didn't go over very well, and there is no Queen without Freddie Mercury. So Freddie Mercury cannot be the weakest link in Queen. That leaves us with Brian May, the guitar player, Roger Taylor, the drummer, and John Deacon, the bass player. Now, Brian May is most well known for his signature guitar sound. It's not his technique, it's not his songwriting, it's the unique sound that his guitar makes, and it is a legendary guitar that was handcrafted by himself and his father. They designed it, they built it, they wound the coils for it themselves, and it is a unique instrument in the world of rock and roll. There's not another one quite like it. So when you're talking about Brian May, you're also talking about Brian May's guitar, the actual piece of gear that he's using. And that has to be kept firmly in mind. If you brought another guitar player into Queen, say, Jimmy Page or Jeff Beck, they could probably do a really good job of filling in that role, but it wouldn't have that exact same Brian May signature sound. Whether or not that would change the band in such a way that they wouldn't succeed is arguable. So let's not take Brian May off the table. Let's just set him aside for a moment. And now we're going to move on. We're going to talk about John Deacon. So the first thing to say about John Deacon is he wrote I Want to Break Free, he co-wrote Under Pressure, and he wrote another one, Bites the Dust, You're My Best Friend. He is a significant songwriter. He is a significant contributor to the creative direction of the band. The other thing that I want to say about him is that he's a beast on the bass. You have to go back to the earlier Queen albums to really get the feel for how great of a rock and roll bass player he was. So go back to Queen 1, the very first album, and you can hear that Queen had a rhythm section at that point that was giving Black Sabbath a run for its money. So Keep Yourself Alive and Great King Rat and songs like this are just incredible displays of both the bass playing and the drumming, which brings me to Roger Taylor. Now, in addition to what I just said, Roger Taylor playing with an extreme amount of intensity on the first couple of albums with a much more heavy approach to the music, where he has like a Mitch Mitchell type approach where he's very busy on the drums, and as they became more of a pop streamlined band by the time you get to Another One Bites the Dust and some of their more famous songs like that, the drums had really toned down. And of course on We Will Rock You, they are the simplest pattern you can imagine, and just to get that anthem thing rolling. But back in the day, back in the early 70s and late 60s, Roger Taylor was very well known as an innovative drummer, as a very accomplished technical drummer. So the rhythm section of Queen, as I say, particularly on the early albums, is a driving force. It continues to be a driving force in the band all the way up through to the end. And if you look at a song like Hammer Fall, and that song was written by Brian May, and it's going to throw back to the first heavier sound of Queen, and you can really see the rhythm section, they still have this enormous power. So the rhythm section in Queen is much more important than a lot of people might give it credit for, because Freddie Mercury's personality and his operatic vocals are so overpowering and overshadowing. But now that we're down to choosing between Brian May, Roger Taylor, and John Deacon, so I would be tempted, almost tempted, to call Brian May the weakest link in Queen, because, as I say, I can think of a lot of guitarists that could have stepped into that role to basically provide an effects guitar. Now, it wouldn't sound like Brian May, but it would still have a sound of the almost like a synthesizer sound and an operatic sound that would complement Freddie Mercury's songwriting and singing. But I'm not going to call Brian May the weak link, because he was so instrumental on the first few albums. Before Freddie Mercury was able to fully step into his own as a songwriter, Brian May was writing a lot of songs. So if you go back to the first album, you got Keep Yourself Alive, you've got Doing All Right, you've got The Night Comes Down, you've got Son and Daughter, and these are all really strong songs that are built around Brian May's guitar work and songwriting. I think that you can't eliminate Brian May. He's as fundamental to the overall DNA of the band as Freddie Mercury, so those two are off the table. Now we're left with Roger Taylor and John Deacon, and it is a very, very tough call. They're both important songwriters. The rhythm section is just one of those situations where they meld together so well, like Mick Fleetwood and John McVie, that it's really tough to break them up. But in this case, I'm going to reluctantly say that Roger Taylor, his playing, while it is accomplished and technical, particularly on the first two albums, his circular style, his Mitchell type style, doesn't exactly match the more Black Sabbath-y riffs and direction that the band was in. So there's a tiny bit of a mismatch from the very beginning. That said, I'm still not going to call him the weakest link. The reason I'm not going to call him the weakest link is because of his songwriting more than compensates for, and I'm not calling it a flaw in his drumming, I'm calling it a slight mismatch in the overall chemistry of the band, where I think they needed just a slightly heavier drummer, and I think they compensated for that later when they got electronic drums to just really boost his sound a little bit. He just plays a little bit too gently for such a big stadium operatic band. So with all that said, we come down to John Deacon, who doesn't deserve to be called the weakest link in the band, but nonetheless is going to have to be, because though he contributed a number of very important songs, and I love his bass playing, Queen could more than survive without him as a songwriter, because the other three guys are so strong. So if you have to pick a weakest link for this band, which is the whole point of the game, I'm going to have to reluctantly pick John Deacon. And again, I think he's a great bass player. I think Queen is an incredible band, and sometimes this game is just brutal. I'd love to hear your take on this, and not only on my choice, but what your choice might be. So go ahead and leave a comment in the section below, and remember to like and subscribe. Thanks a lot.